In 1990, Claudine Schneider was serving her fifth term as one of Rhode Island's two members of the House of Representatives.
One of the things I realized very early on that people had no clue about how the federal government worked.
Schneider entered politics in the middle of one of the great political transformations of our country, the Reagan Revolution. Reagan's signature policies were tax cuts, predicated on the logic of supply-side economics, also known as trickle-down theory. But Reagan's presidency oozed out into every part of our society.
Batman, what happened? Are you okay?
He slimed me.
Ghostbusters, for example, is probably best remembered for depicting a giant marshmallow man destroying New York City. The main bad guy, though, is actually the Environmental Protection Agency, who are depicted as ruthless bureaucrats out to stop everyone's favorite paranormal hunters.
Hold it! I want this man arrested! Captain, these men are a criminal violation of the Environmental Protection Act! And this explosion...
My favorite, of course, is Back to the Future Part 2. Released in 1989, just after Reagan left office, the movie depicts an alternate future with flying cars, and of course, an AI Ronald Reagan taking orders. And while there are no flying cars today, AI Reagan and cheesy 80s cafes will live forever. But 1989 was more than the year that Back to the Future Part 2 came out. 1989 was the first year of this man's presidency.
I've just received a telephone call from Governor Dukakis.
This is George Herbert Walker Bush the night he was elected. Bush beat Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis in the 1988 presidential election, cementing the GOP's grip on the 1980s. But at the same time, Bush was kind of an awkward heir to the Reagan Revolution.
He was most gracious. His call was personal. It was genuinely friendly, and it was in the great tradition of American politics.
Unlike Reagan, Bush wasn't really known for his communication skills. If you watch videos of him, he's usually hidden behind these sort of big half-rimmed glasses, and when he'd talk, he would often strike this genteel, old money kind of affectation.
One of the things that I was so enthused about working with George Bush is that he was incredibly intelligent and a macro thinker about how we should address various policies. And this was true because of his vast experience in government.
George H.W. Bush in a lot of ways seemed destined to become a president. Growing up in Tony, New England, Bush would attend the prestigious Phillips Andover Academy, then Yale. He was a World War II fighter pilot, and by the 1950s he owned an oil company. But while Bush's roots were in the Republican Party of the past, the party of Lincoln, Bush would be forced to cut his teeth in a new Republican Party, the party of Nixon and Watergate.
Hell no, I feel worse about Watergate than you do. I got involved and out of business and into politics for very idealistic reasons.
Throughout his career, Bush served in the House of Representatives, then was the ambassador to the UN, head of the Republican National Committee, Gerald Ford's liaison to China, and by 1976, he was serving as the director of the CIA.
I'm going to approach this job with pride, and they can have all the jokes they want on television about the CIA. It's vital to the national security of the United States.
But Bush always had his eye on the top prize. In 1980, he ran for president, fighting for the nomination of a Republican Party that was tearing itself apart. After Nixon's resignation, Gerald Ford faced a turbulent primary from none other than Ronald Reagan himself. And Republican primaries back then were knife fights.
But is tough being nasty, or is tough being a leader that people respect? Is toughness shouting and being ugly and trying to stick a knife in somebody? Or is it principle?
The man George Bush would go up against was his future boss, Ronald Reagan. Last week, Lever Times reporter Natalie Bettendorf told us how by 1980, Reagan had become the new prophet of the supply-side sect and a true believer in slashing taxes and defunding the government. After losing the nomination to Reagan, Bush became a Reaganite and joined the ticket as vice president. It all put him one step closer to the presidency, but he may not have realized that he was about to enter a viper pit, where his own party was ready to turn on him at a moment's notice. From the Lever's independent newsroom, this is Tax Revolt, a special series from Lever Time. I'm Arjun Singh. In 1982, 2 years after losing the Republican nomination for president, George H.W. Bush was in hot water. He'd been vice president for 1 year, and boy, what a year it had been. It included a recession and an assassination attempt on Reagan. Bush was mid-flight when it happened, and he may not have even been aware that the cabinet was debating invoking the 25th Amendment, potentially making him the president. These were heady times for Bush. He dealt with spy rings and weapons smugglers. He'd even met Mao Zedong. But on that night in 1982, Bush was preoccupied with something else, making sure that everyone forgot that he'd called the Reagan administration's economic platform Voodoo economics.
Well, what I said back then, it's very hard to find actually, let me start over. One, I didn't say it. Nobody, every network's looked for it, and none can find it. It was never said.
That turned out to be a lie.
So what I'm saying is that it just isn't going to work. And it's very interesting that the man who invested this type of what I call a voodoo economic policy.
To understand why Bush was in such a bind, you need to go back to that 1980 presidential campaign, where he was running against Ronald Reagan. In the spring of 1980, they met for a debate in this giant drab beige room, the setting for what was called the Houston Forum, hosted by the League of Women Voters.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're very pleased tonight to have two candidates for the Republican nomination for the presidency of the United States.
Bush was coming off a fresh win in the Pennsylvania primary, and right out the gate, he came and hit Reagan with a sharp attack on his tax plan.
A big difference, for example, that the governor and I have regards this tax cut. He feels, I don't want to put words in his mouth, and he's here to defend or explain his position.
Okay, or as sharp of an attack as it gets for Bush.
So in my judgment, that economic program would exacerbate the deficit. It would result in less stimulation of the economy because of the conditions. And I believe that before we can have massive across-the-board tax cuts, we've got to get the budget in balance.
George Bush was certainly no fan of increasing taxes, and even in that debate proposed a smaller tax cut for businesses. But his concern was about balancing the budget, and that was rooted in the conventional wisdom of conservative politics at the time. Bush is what's known as a deficit hawk, a kind of Republican who will only endorse cutting taxes if it also means cutting spending somewhere else in the budget. These hawks loathe deficit spending, and they worry that paying the interest on the deficit could burden the economy.
Get in balance by the reduction of expenditures, get in balance by a $20 billion supply-side tax cut, and then begin to reduce rates.
Deficit hawks like Bush were still pro-business and largely in favor of cutting taxes, especially for the top, but not if it came at the cost of creating a deficit.
My whole program is based on getting tax relief, but I'm not going to do it in a way, popular though it may be, that's going to, in my view, make that deficit unsupported.
The federal deficit is a perennial problem in politics because it's the amount of debt that the United States owes. Donald Trump, for example, hated the deficit when he was not the president. But as president, he wants to increase the debt ceiling. Go figure. But in 1980, George Bush feared that Reagan's plan to cut taxes for everyone while increasing spending on things like defense would increase the deficit, which it did. But Bush's view was in the minority of the Republican Party and increasingly becoming incompatible with the Reagan Republicans.
Ronald Reagan had not wanted George Bush to be his vice president. And so it was only at the last minute that Reagan agreed that George Herbert Walker Bush should be his vice president.
That's Michael Gratz, a historian and the author of the book The Power to Destroy: How the Anti-Tax Movement Hijacked America. We heard from him in our previous episodes. Gratz also worked in the Treasury Department during the George H.W. Bush administration.
The Reagan wing of the Republican Party, which was by far the dominant wing at that time, never trusted George Herbert Walker Bush.
I enthusiastically support our platform, and I pledge to you my total dedication and energies.
He was a Texas congressman before he became vice president. He grew up playing squash and baseball at Yale. He was regarded as a patrician and a Northeasterner at heart, and he was never somebody who really gained the enthusiasm and commitment of the Reagan Republicans.
My fellow Republicans, I say to you, let's forget the pollsters and forget the pundits, and remember only that political victories are hard, dedicated things that come about only by tough work.
If you've been listening to the series, you know the rest of the story from here. Reagan knocks Carter out of the White House, and then the Bush clan gets one step closer to the Oval Office. Then, Reagan cuts taxes, wins election, and cuts taxes again. By the end of Reagan's presidency, he'd cut the top rate from 70 to 28%, increased defense spending by more than $100 billion, and created a federal deficit of $153 billion, almost double the one that he inherited. Then, he hands off the reins to his vice president, George H.W. Bush, a man who had once accused Reagan of preaching voodoo economics, but one who had no choice but to lead a party in which many viewed him as a heretic. Even Bush's children were getting devoured by the cult of supply side. Jeb Bush, for example, felt the need to apologize for his dad during a debate in 1984.
When you're competing with someone, you say things you later regret. I guarantee you my father has regretted saying that.
And in the summer of 1988, almost a decade after he missed his chance to become president, George H.W. Bush was coronated the new head of the Republican Party, preaching the very voodoo economics he once warned about.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
After the break, why Republicans are still sour about George H.W. Bush's presidency. We'll be right back. Did you believe Bush when he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes"? Did you trust that?
I did in the following sense. He had had lunch with Ronald Reagan every week for 8 years. 8 years. And I assumed he'd learned something during that time period. Answer is not really. He never did understand economics.
This is Grover Norquist, the president of the activist group Americans for Tax Reform. I met Norquist on a balmy day in Washington in his office in downtown DC.
Do you remember the pledge? The pledge was, I'm running for governor. I will not institute or allow an income tax or a broad-based sales tax. And every Republican took that pledge, and then later Democrats did as well.
Norquist is talking about an anti-tax pledge, and the reason he's asking if I remember it is because I was born in New Hampshire, where politicians have been signing pledges not to raise taxes as far back as the 1950s. In the 1980s, the Reagan White House tapped a young Norquist to head up Americans for Tax Reform, and one of Norquist's ideas was to create a pledge. This pledge is simple. One version of it reads, "I will oppose and vote against any and all efforts to increase taxes." But when Norquist began circulating this pledge in 1986, he quickly realized it could be a powerful way to influence Republican politics.
We realized this was something that helped people win primaries, win generals, and the number of pledge takers grew from there.
So Grover Norquist is like a true believer, and he's also someone who wants to be part of the action. And he's a bit of an opportunist, right? He doesn't start the no tax movement in the Republican Party, but he sees it and he's trying to figure out a way to formalize it.
Nicole Hemmer is an associate professor of history at Vanderbilt University and the author of Partisans, the conservative revolutionaries who remade American politics in the 1990s.
He just sort of like pops up in the documentary record over and over again in the 1980s and 90s, sometimes in the weirdest places, including in some anti-communist rebel camps overseas at various times.
Norquist was part of a generation of conservatives who were amassing power within the Republican Party. These were activists who were riled up by a general sense of disenchantment with the direction of the country. They were even angry at Ronald Reagan.
They want someone who's even more of a bomb thrower than Reagan. And one of the issues that they really sort of run aground on very quickly is his selection of George H.W. Bush as his vice president, because Bush was more of a moderate Republican. So not only were they already mad at Reagan, but now they have to deal with Bush.
I've just repeated, word for word, the oath taken by George Washington 200 years ago. And the Bible on which I placed my hand is the Bible on which he placed his.
On January 20th, 1989, George Herbert Walker Bush finally became president. He won in another landslide election, beating Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. Like Reagan, Bush entered office with Democrats in control of Congress, a situation Norquist and his allies saw as a test for the incoming president.
I come before you and assume the presidency at a moment rich with promise. We live in a peaceful, prosperous time, but we can make it better.
Bush's inaugural speech was draped in the aesthetic of the status quo. The United States as a nation was entering a dramatic new era. The Soviet Union appeared to be weakening. The end of the Cold War was possible. The status quo was over. It was a new world, one where Bush would have to grapple with a changing economy, a diversifying country, and an even angrier conservative movement that already hated him.
Some see leadership as high drama and the sound of trumpets calling, and sometimes it is that. But I see history as a book with many pages, and each day we fill a page with acts of hopefulness and meaning.
I could not have been elected as a right-wing candidate. It is impossible to build a majority. Even many of the conservatives would not have voted to put in the whip's position somebody who was unable to reach out.
Newt Gingrich claimed to come in peace. A few months into the Bush presidency, Gingrich was elected to be the whip for the Republicans in the House of Representatives, meaning it was his job to keep Republicans in line. That job is especially important when Congress and the White House are controlled by the same party. But Democrats controlled Congress, and Gingrich had a bigger problem to deal with. Here's Princeton historian Julian Zelitzer to explain.
Bush epitomized the kind of Republican that Gingrich really didn't like, who Gingrich was attacking as fiercely as he attacked Democrats, meaning someone from Washington, someone who's very much part of that bipartisan system, someone who believed in the inside game. That was what Gingrich was against. And so Bush was never someone he, had very warm feelings to.
Gingrich's career was defined by his opposition to the federal government. He was elected to Congress in 1978, the same year Howard Jarvis motivated Californians to enact Prop 13.
He quickly sees one of the big issues is going to be cutting taxes and going against taxes. It's the year a lot of conservatives are starting to pay attention to how tax cuts can be as defining as anti-communism as a uniting issue.
In the 80s, Gingrich would strike a now familiar Republican tone. He was enthusiastic to cut taxes, but he quickly latched on to the political power of framing the tax issue as a means of defunding federal workers, agents of a federal government people like Gingrich were increasingly resentful of. Here he is in 1984, for example, during an interview with the show Viewpoint.
We have to be as aggressive and as tough on the bureaucracy and on the interest groups as raising taxes would be on working Americans.
Gingrich was the political flank of what was being called the New Right, conservatives who were more rambunctious and combative, and they had no patience for liberal politics. Stuck in the minority of a Democratic House for the first decade of his career, Gingrich saw the anti-tax movement as one piece of the puzzle to how he'd take control.
He's focused on power, and his real issue is how can Republicans win control of Congress, of the House, for the first time since 1954. And I think a lot of what he does beyond his personal power is really focused on that, and taxes fit. It fit very nicely, which is what Ronald Reagan realized as well.
Gingrich's path to power is a classic Washington tale. He arrives in Congress and aligns himself with the president, but he quickly gets a secret weapon: C-SPAN.
The fact is that the large liberal welfare state that we inherited, that came to us through the last 30 years of adding more bureaucracy, more offices in Washington, more transfer payments, cannot possibly be sustained.
Gingrich saw the advantage of giving floor speeches, and he realized quickly how this new medium could give him power.
They go on the floor and make these short speeches that C-SPAN covers, and they're very blistering speeches, and he gets a lot of media attention as someone who's willing to do what is necessary to win.
The thing is, most of the time the chamber was empty. But for anyone tuning into C-SPAN, all they would see was Gingrich day after day down on the House floor, giving speech after speech, probably unaware he was talking to an audience of nobody. That was something Nicole Hemmer and I talked about too, that by the time Bush became president and Gingrich was in House leadership, the media environment had changed around them.
Two big forces are surging within the conservative movement and in the political culture more generally that Bush has to contend with. And one of them is talk radio and Rush Limbaugh.
I believe people turn on radio to be entertained, to be entertained, to be entertained. And no matter what they're turning it on for, what kind of programming, it has to entertain them.
He's a non-factor in the Reagan years. But over the course of Bush's 4 years in office, Limbaugh is going to become a juggernaut. He's going to become a kingmaker within the Republican Party. And he is part of the rise of this kind of purity politics.
My success is not determined by who wins elections, and my success is not determined by what issues dominate. My success is determined by how many people listen to my radio show.
Meanwhile, the hangover of Reagan's economic policies was starting to settle in, and it was Bush's worst fear. The deficit was high, the budget was not balanced, and the entire mood of the country felt sour, especially if you listen to right-wing talk radio.
He also has to contend with a real economic change and a kind of gloominess and uncertainty that descends across the country. The Reagan administration had just blown these huge holes in the deficit. So there were enormous deficits. The Cold War comes to an end, and suddenly this thing that had been holding not just the right together, but the entire political system in the United States together, this thing that the country was oriented around for decades, was gone kind of overnight.
After the break, we'll hear about the budget deal that broke Bush. We'll be right back. Did you feel that this 1990 election was, not necessarily a battle for the soul of the party, but that there was a tension between Bush Republicans, people who would do the balanced budget, people like you who wanted to do the fraud, and then I'll just name them, the Gingriches out there? I'm sure you've crossed his path before.
Many times. I mean, at our weekly meetings among the moderates, and they actually nicknamed us the Gypsy Moths because they found us to be a pain because we did not march lockstep.
This is Claudine Schneider again, the former Republican congresswoman who served in the House during the Bush and Reagan administrations.
Gingrich would come to our weekly meetings and listen in. So we were very clear that, we'll listen to reason, but we're going to move ahead. And I think that more than anything, the Republican Party at that time was interested in the numbers.
Numbers meaning the amount of Republicans it would take to control Congress. Schneider was a close ally of Bush, and she has an enormous amount of respect for the president. 1990, the second year of Bush's presidency, also happened to be a midterm election year, meaning Congress was up for grabs for both parties. That year, Bush wanted Claudine Schneider to leave the House. He asked her if she'd consider running for Senate.
He said, the incumbent senator is up for re-election. What are you thinking of doing? And I said, well, I think I could accomplish twice as much, twice as fast, being a woman and having the fire in my belly.
But the day before the election, November 5th, 1990, Bush did something that would define his presidency. He raised taxes.
This agreement will also raise revenue. I'm not, and I know you're not, a fan of tax increases. But if there have to be tax measures, they should allow the economy to grow.
Did Bush break the pledge he made to the Republicans when he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes"? Yes. But it isn't really accurate to say that Bush did a 180 on taxes. See, like Reagan, Bush had also been saddled with a democratically controlled Congress. That was actually why people like Grover Norquist wanted Bush to make an anti-tax pledge in the 1988 campaign.
he there said, the Democrats are going to come and ask me to raise taxes. I'll say no. They'll come back and ask me to raise taxes, and I'll say no. They'll come back to ask me to raise taxes, and I will. And the famous part that people remember is, I will say, read my lips, no new taxes. He told you step by step what the Democrats would do. They'll try, they'll try again, they'll keep trying, I'll keep saying no. And he failed on the third no part.
Failing on the third part is one of the things most associated with Bush's presidency. But it's not quite as simple as Grover Norquist says, according to Michael Gratz.
I was very much involved in those negotiations. I was at the Treasury at the time. I was at Andrews Air Force Base where the budget negotiations took place.
Throughout 1990, Bush held multiple negotiations with congressional leaders. One of them took place over the course of 11 days and at Andrews Air Force Base near D.C. And these were not easy days.
I would leave about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, go home. My son was about 18 months old at the time, and he would hear me come up the stairs, and I would get up at 6 o'clock, and we'd go back to the Andrews Air Force Base.
For Bush, at the heart of this dilemma was the national debt that Ronald Reagan had left him with, the very thing he warned Reagan about in the 1980 debate.
The debt that had accumulated during the Reagan administration was greater than all of the debt of the United States of all of the presidents leading up to Ronald Reagan.
Bush was also set up to fail by Reagan in another way. In 1985, Reagan signed the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings Act, or GRH, a law that mandated necessary spending cuts if the deficit reached a certain level, a process known as sequestration. But despite the law, Congress couldn't agree on a deficit package, so they kicked the can down the road. It would be the next president's problem.
And when Reagan was asked after his presidency, do you have any regrets about your presidency? He said, yes, the deficits, which in many ways, the ironic laughter has to well up inside of you when you hear that.
Reagan extended GRH's deadline to 1993, but that could have been the first year of Bush's second term, and budget projections predicted the sequestration would have to take place, which would mean a 42% cut in defense spending and a 64% cut in non-defense spending. There was no way this was going to end well for George Bush. It was like a ticking time bomb. So in the summer of 1990, Bush released a statement saying he'd be open to tax increases. The blowback was swift. Later, Bush's vice president Dan Quayle said that he thought Bush had eliminated the Republicans' only talking point, that Republicans never raise taxes. But Bush hoped that his fellow Republicans would support him as their leader. So on September 30th, 1990, he stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, flanked by his cabinet, and told the country, mission accomplished.
I do not welcome any such tax measure, nor do I expect anybody up here does. However, this one does have the virtue not only of contributing to deficit reduction, but also, over time, of decreasing America's dependence on foreign oil.
But Bush's rhetoric belied a grim truth. He didn't have the votes. Just before that announcement, Newt Gingrich said he was out.
Gingrich ostentatiously walks out of the White House in front of the television cameras, making it clear that he can't support this agreement. They were convinced that he was going along, and he walks out and immediately starts a revolt of the House Republicans against the budget agreement.
Then, Bush's worst fears finally came true. As the swirling forces of the growing anti-tax movement and the uncontrollable winds of the economy battered down the White House, the government shut down. Bush had scrambled in the week after his Rose Garden announcement to build back the support for the agreement, but he failed, and Bush was exasperated.
We're flexible. I've already compromised, and I'm not saying that I can't take a look at new proposals, but you got to put together a majority in the Congress.
With a shutdown government, Bush made a compromise. Congress passed a resolution to reopen the government, and by November, the new budget bill was signed into law, including raising the top marginal tax rate. Grover Norquist, the anti-tax activist who helped radicalize the Republican Party against taxes, saw Bush's actions as only one thing: betrayal.
You don't have to have lived through it to have learned that George Walker Bush, who should have had on his tombstone, won Cold War, kicked Iraq out of Kuwait. Okay. Instead, it says liar, raise taxes.
Bush's decision would reverberate throughout conservative circles. By 1992, when he was running for re-election, Bush was forced to get into the mosh pit of right-wing media, which also meant having to hear how conservatives like Rush Limbaugh were upset with him.
There are those who say that they feel let down, they're disappointed. There is some anger at things that have happened in your first term. And what would you say to those people, who I think are a considerable number? What would you say to them, those who are just frustrated at what seems to be things that went wrong in your first term?
I'd say, look at the whole picture. I'd say, yes, I've made mistakes. I'm human. But take a look at the whole picture, and I think you'll see a record that you can put your trust in.
That year, the economy was sluggish, and Bush knew it would be used against him. He also knew that his tax pledge would come back to bite him. If anything, because it was the biggest lesson Newt Gingrich took away from that moment. Here's Julian Zelitzer again.
He really gives voice to congressional Republicans who are saying this isn't just one issue among many, this is going to be the issue. And secondly, he does something dramatic, and in politics that matters, meaning he won't accept a Republican president who enters into this deficit reduction deal. And by doing it so publicly and making public statements against the president who's still going to run for a second term, I think that's how he becomes a voice, not necessarily for being the creator of the issue, but now for being the champion who is going to be the principled person who won't bend, who won't make bipartisan deals that undercut that issue.
It seemed like nobody was happy with Bush. Despite public support for his handling of the Gulf War, Bush was seen as a weak candidate, an opportunity for Democrats and even some conservatives.
Bush betrayed our trust. He raised our taxes. Can we afford 4 more years of broken promises? Send Bush a message. Vote Pat Buchanan for president.
Paid for by Buchanan for president.
In politics, there's this loose rule that says that whenever the president faces a serious primary challenge from within their own party, they're going to lose the election. It had happened to Lyndon B. Johnson, and then Jimmy Carter, and in 1992, a man named Pat Buchanan wanted to add Bush to that list. Pat Buchanan was hardly a political outsider. He'd served for 2 years as the head of communications in the Reagan White House, but he chose to run an avowedly anti-establishment campaign.
Give me your votes, and I will go to Washington, and as your president, I will stand up to Congress and get the job done. Those who did this to you have forgotten you and walked away from you.
If that all sounds familiar, it's because Buchanan was the prototype for the kind of campaign Donald Trump would run more than 20 years later.
I don't think it's the vision the American people need to get the economy moving again, and it's certainly not the long-term strategy to make America first again in manufacturing, industry, business the way we once were.
Like Trump, Buchanan railed against free trade agreements that his boss Ronald Reagan and then George Bush were championing. He was racist and nativist, frequently using his campaign as an opportunity to rail against immigrants. Here's Nicole Hemmer again.
The 1992 primary is one of those moments where you see the bubbling up of the discontent and the division within the Republican Party. So you've had this new right that has been, talking about Reagan is too moderate, Bush is definitely too moderate, but you didn't necessarily have any figures on the right who were the repository of that movement, who were the symbol of that movement. And in 1992, you get Pat Buchanan as the voice of that opposition on the right.
Mr. Bush's problem the last 3 years is that whenever it comes to a crunch with Congress, for example, over the new taxes, George Bush walks up and cuts a deal out at Andrews Air Force Base, capitulates, caves in, compromises.
And so it begins to crystallize what the right-wing opposition to the Reagan-Bush administrations actually looks like. And so that makes it this powerful, important moment because it shows you the divisions in the right are not between a conservative like Reagan and a more moderate candidate, which is what you saw in 1980, but they are between Reagan and a more right-wing candidate. And that shows you the direction that the Republican Party is going to move in the decades that follow.
The problem is, I think, is the president's disposition and style and his basic lack of conviction and philosophy and ideas.
Buchanan didn't win any primaries, but he still managed to secure almost 3 million Republican votes. Bush would then run a fairly lackluster campaign in what was a very strange political year. His Democratic opponent was Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, and billionaire Ross Perot jumped into the race. Between Buchanan's run, the anti-tax movement, and Perot, the odds were against Bush. Even the Clinton team couldn't help but take advantage of this discontent, going so far as to run attack ads that criticized Bush for both raising taxes and not raising taxes enough on the wealthy.
1988.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
Then George Bush signed the second biggest tax increase in American history.
Read my lips.
George Bush increased taxes on the middle class. Bush doubled the beer tax and increased the gas tax by 56%. Now George Bush wants to give a $108,000 tax break to millionaires. $108,000. Guess who's going to pay? We can't afford 4 more years.
This ad triggers Grover Norquist to this day.
Same ad. He wanted to raise taxes, the bum. And 2, he didn't want to raise taxes on the rich. So he had a bill to raise taxes on the rich, and he was attacked from the Democrats for raising taxes in general, and 2, not raising taxes on the rich, because he didn't raise taxes on the rich as much as they wanted to. Mm-hmm. So we've had a test case. How did the Democrats respond? And did anyone in the media say, that's the most dishonest ad I've ever seen in my life? Or at least misleading a little bit, just a teeny bit misleading? No, nobody in the press said it was misleading. And nobody on the left goes, oh, that George Bush, what a guy.
As you can hear, Norquist is still bitter about this moment. But he's not alone. In his book, The Power to Destroy How the Anti-Tax Movement Hijacked America, Michael Gratz, who we heard from earlier, says the 1992 election isn't necessarily pivotal because the voters pushed Republicans further into being a tax-cutting party, but that instead this was how Republicans interpreted their loss. Meanwhile, the new president was Bill Clinton, a Democrat who sounded less like Lyndon B. Johnson and ironically a little bit more like Ronald Reagan.
Our federal government today is the smallest it has been in 30 years, and it's getting smaller every day. We know big government does not have all the answers. We know there's not a program for every problem.
Clinton wanted to shrink the federal government, even enacting his own program to eliminate waste and redundancies. But he still wanted to raise taxes, giving Newt Gingrich his opportunity to finally take power.
And the American people deserve better. They deserve to be told the truth. But liberal Democrats can't tell you the truth, because if they try to tell you the truth, you'll laugh them away.
In the first years of the Clinton presidency, Gingrich played the part of resident troll, but he was about to take the anti-tax movement to the next level with something he called the contract with America.
We're here because we are taking the first steps, and we're taking them in a contract with the American people. We've already told the incumbents and the candidates that if we have a majority, if the American people accept this contract, that they can expect to work 5 days a week in January, 6 days a week in February and March, and 24 hours a day around the clock towards the end if necessary. But we are going to get to the final recorded votes in the first 100 days on every item.
Included in it was an anti-tax pledge like Norquist, and 367 Republicans signed it that year. And then Gingrich finally won. In 1994, the Republicans took over the People's House, and Gingrich became Speaker.
With faith and with friendship and the deepest respect, you are now my Speaker, and let the great debate begin.
It was the first time in almost half a century that Republicans controlled the House, and Gingrich, the conservative bomb thrower who is now the congressional face of the anti-tax movement, was calling the shots.
I now have the high honor and distinct privilege to present to the House of Representatives our new Speaker, the gentleman from Georgia, Newt Gingrich.
Gingrich was now the establishment, whether Clinton or the Bush family liked it or not. He was the new North Star of the Republican Party.
Gingrich becomes Speaker, he wins control, and in 95 and 96 you have a government shutdown, And that revolves around very deep spending cuts that the Republicans under Gingrich want to make to reduce the deficit. But that isn't a deal with tax increases. That is gone. And you can fast forward to the Tea Party, where you still have budget hawks, but budget hawks doesn't mean what Bush did in 1990. That gets really purged from the Republican agenda.
And whereas George Bush was anxious over a government shutdown that lasted one weekend, in 1995 and 1996, Gingrich would have a standoff with Clinton that would result in the government being shut down for more than 21 days. The shutdown was a bold legislative tactic, one that Bill Clinton made a point to condemn.
It is wrong. It is deeply wrong to shut the government down while we negotiate, under the illusion that somehow that will affect the decisions that I would make on specific issues.
The weird thing is, though, Gingrich's shutdown wasn't popular. Senator Bob Dole of Kansas, a deficit hawk like Bush, and a leader in the party, took to the Senate floor referring to federal workers as hostages, clearly frustrated with Gingrich's stunt.
They shouldn't be hostages, shouldn't be pawns, and we ought to end this. I mean, it's gotten to the point where it's a little ridiculous as far as this senator is concerned.
But Dole was a dinosaur. The new Republican Party was in power, and they were extreme and united under the banner of the anti-tax pledge. And signing the pledge became the cost of joining the party.
There were tons of others who were really concerned that if they didn't sign the no tax pledge, they would lose funding, they would get beaten up in this newly powerful right-wing media, that they would face pushback from these organizations like Heritage and AEI. So there's a new set of organized, powerful, monetized pressures that these members of Congress face that make the decision to sign the no new tax pledge one that is as much of a pressure campaign as it is a kind of shared sentiment.
So what was the point of all of this? In our first two episodes, we told you how the California tax revolt of 1978 inspired Ronald Reagan to cut taxes as president. And then we heard how Jack Kemp, a Republican congressman, was motivated to eliminate taxes because he thought it would unleash productivity. As Julian Zellitzer told me, though, Gingrich only seemed to want power, and the tax issue was a means to do that. But what about Grover Norquist? Norquist Americans for Tax Reform is a powerful organization, but Norquist has never been an elected official. He's not an economist, and when we spoke, he barely talked about economics. To him, the tax issue came down to one thing.
Taxes defund the state, and the state is an awkward entity that can't do certain things, okay? Sometimes, well, we'll have the government do this. And the answer is you can't use that. You can't use the government to do that. No, we're going to have the government educate people. We've tried that. And a government monopoly. Educate children. That doesn't work. It's like somebody, you can be very well-meaning and walk in with a baseball bat and offer to remove somebody's kidney for them, but it's not going to work.
Using a baseball bat to do kidney surgery is what Norquist thinks the federal government does every day. To Norquist, being anti-tax is a means of achieving his ultimate goal, defunding the government. Pat Buchanan also wanted to shrink the government, but because he thought it was too tolerant of immigrants and minorities. And this was always an element to the 1970s anti-tax movement that we covered in our first episode.
So in 1978, Jimmy Carter's IRS decides that it's going to seriously enforce rules that had been in place since 1970 but had not been enforced, to take away charitable deductions and tax-exempt status from segregated schools in the South.
Newt Gingrich saw all of this happening around him in Georgia in the 1970s. The federal government and the IRS became symbols of integration. The anti-tax movement became a means for angry voters to fight back.
This galvanized the Christian evangelical movement. It was an important but mainly overlooked aspect of Reagan's campaign for the presidency. Reagan said he was going to reverse the IRS position.
Nicole Hemmer thinks that by the end of the 1990s, this anti-IRS sentiment grew into something we see in Republican politics today.
conservatives are coming off of a decade of controlling the federal government, and the federal government hasn't actually gone down in size. And Black people haven't been put back in their place, nor have women, nor have immigrants. And it becomes apparent to activists, or activists seize on the argument that, the problem isn't who's running the government, the problem is the government itself. It's too big. There are too many bureaucrats in it. When conservatives get into power, they can't actually do anything to diminish the size of it. And the rhetoric becomes increasingly not just, anti-taxes or anti-particular parts of the government. It's not just opposed to the Department of Education or to the EPA. Now it's, the government itself is the problem. And that had been part of Reagan's rhetoric. But as the head of the government, he wasn't necessarily a very good standard bearer for that.
That was also a problem for the president who came after Bill Clinton.
Today, I am sending to Congress my plan to provide relief to all income taxpayers, which I believe will help jumpstart the American economy. We must give overcharged taxpayers some of their own money back.
George Walker Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, was elected president in 2000. Bush wanted to follow in his father's footsteps, but for most of his life, he never seemed like the chosen son. Unlike his dad, W grew up in Texas and embraced the state's swagger. In his youth, he was rambunctious and a troublemaker, but he was still a Bush. He went to Yale, like his dad, and became a businessman, like his dad, and then he became a politician, just like his dad.
What Texans can dream, Texans can do.
George W. Bush was elected governor of Texas in 1994, the same year Republicans took back the House. But despite his name, Bush wasn't really like his dad. He was actually a little bit more like Grover Norquist and Newt Gingrich's Frankenstein.
What's interesting about George W. Bush, when people looked at him within the Republican Party as, what is his lineage, they didn't actually point to his father. They pointed to Reagan. They saw him as a continuation of Reaganism, that he had this upbeat, optimistic personality. He had this folksiness to him.
I made it clear to the citizens up there. I oppose breaching those dams. I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully.
And he also kind of had that same big government conservatism to him. He didn't care as much about the details. And he was willing to just swing for the fences, and he'll give you your lower taxes. And if it blows a hole in the budget and the deficits skyrocket, well, he doesn't care because he knows that you don't actually care about the deficit either.
And so 8 years after his father was pummeled in the 1992 election for raising taxes by Gingrich, Norquist, Buchanan, and even Bill Clinton, George Bush enters office with a bold plan. Yup, to cut taxes. Here he is less than a month after being president.
Tax relief is right, and tax relief is urgent.
Another key difference from his dad is Bush entered with Republican majorities in Congress. This time there was no negotiating with Democrats. But it also meant confronting the same movement that still harbors resentment over what happened in 1990.
The party has changed, and it's in part what Bush does that changes them and hardens that resistance. So by the time the younger Bush comes into office in 2001, there's just not a lot of support in the Republican Party for a Republican who's going to call for tax increases. So he comes into a party that has, in part taken form in response to his dad.
George W. Bush didn't care about the deficit, and he played nice with folks like Grover Norquist. But he would share one similarity with his father. He helped push the Republican Party further to the right. Bush's decision to launch two devastating and mismanaged wars in Iraq and Afghanistan after slashing taxes drained the federal budget, kicking up deficits once again. And at the end of his presidency, the housing market popped, setting off a domino chain of events that ended up in a major financial crisis and a global recession. In response, one of the last things Bush did during his presidency was have the government buy up what were called toxic assets from major banks. Basically, it was a cash loan to help banks weather the crisis. George Bush was there from the government, and he wanted to help Wall Street. That decision formed the bedrock of the political situation in the United States that I came of age in. The financial crisis and its handling to it inspired another tax revolt, this one modeled after the Boston Tea Party. I covered one of the first Tea Party protests for my high school newspaper in 2009. Like Jarvis's tax revolt, it was a conservative movement, but this time it had a heaping dose of anti-government and anti-establishment rhetoric taken straight out of the Buchanan era. And by 2010, the Tea Party was deeply embedded within Republican politics.
The powers that be here in Washington, D.C., specifically in the White House, have been wrong about a few things. Wrong about everything. Is that it? Wrong. You can always count on a Tea Partier to get it right.
Like the 70s anti-tax movement, the Tea Party's populist but largely anti-government rhetoric had a left-wing mirror, the Occupy Wall Street movement. The country was angry, and it set the stage for a brewing cynicism, one that got us right up to 2016.
Big business, elite media, and major donors are lining up behind the campaign of my opponent because they know she will keep our rigged system in place.
Trump swept into power, taking advantage of this rage. He painted the entire federal government as a bunch of overpaid insiders out to screw the working person over.
Trump is very much the heir to not Reagan or either of the Bushes, but to Pat Buchanan. He takes the grievance politics and right-wing populism of Pat Buchanan, turns it up to 11, and drops any of the kind of intellectual pretenses and just goes kind of with the emotional beats of that right-wing populism and turns it into governing.
The real irony of Trump's efforts to push through tax cuts is that he himself seems to acknowledge the importance of America's broad social safety net. That's kind of the irony of all of these tax cutters. But this time does seem different. Elon Musk, the nominal head of Doge, doesn't seem to mind kicking people off Medicare or Social Security, and he's totally fanned the flames of the anti-tax movement. It all kind of seems like the government Grover Norquist wants. So, next week, we'll hear if Norquist has finally won.
Trump's a great guy, and he's a person. He's one guy. This is a political movement. This is a Reagan Republican territory. Don't ever raise taxes, which, by the way, is also Trump's position.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. Lever Time is part of the Lever's investigative newsroom and distributed by PRX. This episode was produced by me, Arjun Singh, and edited by Chris Walker, with help from Natalie Bettendorf and Ariella Markowitz. It had editing support from Joel Warner, Lucy Dean Stockton, Jared Jakang Mayer, and David Sirota. Our theme music was composed by Nick Campbell. We'll be back next week with another episode of Lever Time.